Hello and welcome to this lecture on the basis for ethics. This chapter will cover most of the material found in Chapter 1 of Richard Rowson's Working Ethics, our textbook for this semester. This, however, shouldn't inspire you not to read the chapter. There is much in the chapter that won't be covered in this lecture. In this chapter, Richard Rowson and we are going to examine some of the sources for guidance. Ethics is one of those sources, but it's not the only one. Ethics is a particular standpoint from which to assess conduct in terms of right and wrong, ought or ought not, permissible and impermissible. But it's not the only possible standpoint from which we can make conclusions about what we ought to do, about what's right or what's wrong, or what is permissible or impermissible. Law, for example, is one such standpoint, and it serves as a general standpoint for assessing the conduct of everyone who falls under the law, everyone who is subject to the law. From this standpoint, we ask whether a particular conduct in question violates existing laws. If yes, then the conduct is wrong. If not, then the conduct is right, or at least not wrong, which is the same as it being permissible. Religions also establish a standpoint for the faithful for assessing their own conduct and the conduct of others of their faith. From this standpoint, we ask whether the conduct violates divine will or religious prescriptions. If yes, then it's wrong. If no, then it's not wrong. Social conventions offer us yet another standpoint from which we can assess conduct, and under this standpoint we would assess the conduct of our fellow members of society and ourselves according to the criteria that the society adopts. From this standpoint we would ask whether the conduct contravenes customs or traditions or socially recognized expectations. If so, then that conduct would be wrong. If not, then that conduct would be permissible or right. In addition to law, religion, and social custom, we have other sources of guidance, other standpoints that use the language that is very moral sounding, that is the language of oughts and shoulds and musts. These additional sources of guidance are less popular but still relevant. First, we might think about professional codes of conduct. And what we do here is ask professionals whether their conduct contravenes the principles and rules accepted by the relevant professional association. That's about all we'll say on professional codes of conduct at this point, but in Learning Module 2 we will examine professional codes of conduct in more detail. Another additional source of guidance is aesthetics, which asks us to examine the conduct in light of such aesthetic values as beauty, disgust, inspiration, putridity. So if the conduct is beautiful or disgusting, inspiring or putrid, then we can make judgments about whether that conduct ought or ought not to be done. If the conduct conforms to what's beautiful or inspiring, then generally it would be deemed to be the right sort of thing to do. And if that conduct can be described aesthetically as disgusting or putrid, then those would be terms that would indicate that that would be the kind of conduct that one should avoid, that would be impermissible, and one ought not to do it. Politics offers yet another guidance. I know it sounds odd to talk about politics as a source of guidance for what we ought to do, but let's think about it even in the negative terms. That is, that politics can offer us guidance for what we ought not to do, especially if our politics are particularly corrupt. But from the standpoint of politics, we can ask whether the conduct in question conforms to or enhances the attainment of some political or ideological goals. And that's indeed how we generally identify whether there is corruption or not in our politics. If the actions and conduct of our politicians, our legislators, our administrators are such that they thwart the attainment of political or ideological goals, then we would generally call that conduct corrupt, and those politicians corrupt. Finally, another source of guidance for what we ought to do comes from practicality. And in practicality, what we do is we assess right or wrong, good or bad, by an action or a conduct's efficiency and effectiveness to generate some specified end or goal. And so if the conduct is practically effective, then it would be good. If it's practically ineffective, then it would be bad or wrong. However, none of these value-rich standpoints, including professional ethics codes, replaces the need for an ethical standpoint. Even ethics codes can't replace an ethical standpoint. Ethics codes and codes of conduct are generally derivative from some particular ethical standpoint. Recall the lecture on practical ethics, where what we want to do is examine how practitioners see good conduct, good practice, and identify values from that. And that's what can inform an ethics code. But an ethics code can't replace an ethical standpoint, even for a particular profession. Let's take a look at some of these in more detail. Especially we're going to look at law, religion, and social convention in a little more detail. Ethics often is mistaken for law. That is, often when we are accused of having bad behavior or conducting ourselves ill or doing what we ought not to do, we might respond by saying, but whatever it is I'm doing, at least it's not against the law, as though that somehow absolves us of the moral charge, the ethical charge of the violation. So we often confuse ethics for law, and so we think that whatever is ethically permissible is within the bounds of the law. And this is especially so for heavily regulated public servants and professionals, where their contact is almost on a daily basis with the law in various ways. So one of the claims that's important here is that both the law and ethics are either the same or inextricably intertwined. That is, if they're not the same, then they're so related, they're so closely related, we can't separate one from the other such that we can get a clear picture on ethics without also at the same time having the necessity for a clear picture of the law. There are, however, some objections to this view. First objection to this view: in diverse societies there is often little consensus on ethics. And so if we think that our law and our ethics should be the same and should be identical, then we would expect there to be much more consensus on our ethics, since we seem to have quite a high degree of consensus on our laws. There's also disagreement about whether or not the law should enforce any kind of ethical standards at all. A second objection to the view, or to the claim, that the law and ethics are intertwined inextricably or are the same thing, is that law permits ethically troubling conduct. For example, the law permits lying. It's not against the law to lie. But it prohibits ethically untroubling conduct, conduct that isn't really wrong or harmful in any way. For example, allowing your dog to run in the river in Sacramento, that's against the law. Or having a vegetable garden in your front yard, again in Sacramento, that's against the law, and you can be fined for doing so. And yet these are examples of two ethically untroubling actions. A third objection to the view that the law and ethics are inextricably intertwined or the same thing is that what we want to do is notice that when we enforce morality, when we enforce ethics with the power of the law, and the power of the law entails usually sanction of some sort, if not criminal, then civil, that doing so denies important individual freedoms. And finally, another objection is that the law is a tool that is inappropriately flexible and sensitive to the needs and circumstances that individuals find themselves in. The law is often referred to as a big stick, a heavy hammer, and sometimes what we need is something more gentle, something a little bit more flexible and compliant with circumstances and conditions. Another kind of claim we can have about the relationship between ethics and law is that they are distinct but overlapping standpoints. And so what we notice in support of this claim is that the law is derived from legislative action and judicial precedent. But we also notice that many of our laws are informed by ethics, almost as much as they're informed by religion or by social convention. So the law itself can have many bases of influence. However, the law cannot replace ethics. They may be overlapping and distinct standpoints. One cannot replace the other. We cannot have a sufficiently organized and orderly society if we relied on ethics without law, nor is it sufficient to determine what right and good conduct is simply by having the law replace ethics altogether. All right, let's look a little bit more closely at the relationship between ethics and religion. Similarly, ethics is often mistaken for religion, and that should not be surprising. In large part, religious belief provides powerful motivation to comply with requirements for good conduct. For many religions, salvation depends on good conduct, so there's a pretty significant motivator if you don't otherwise find the conduct appealing. And religious belief also provides an integrated worldview, which can provide comforting uniformity and consistency in the requirements for our action. Most religions have a highly developed and integrated worldview. That is, they present the world in a certain way to people of that faith, such that the requirements for acting in a certain way make complete sense within that worldview. And that can be incredibly comforting and inspiring to act as one ought to act. Ethics and religion, closely intertwined, also makes sense because for many of us, religion is our very first encounter with any kind of prescriptions on our actions outside of our parents. For most of us, our religious education, whether it's formal or informal, is often the first place that we see articulated principles and rules that we ought to live by. For example, there's a popular saying, "What would Jesus do?" And what that inspires the faithful to do is imagine how Jesus would respond in the particular situation they find themselves in, and then to act accordingly. And in Islam, there are similar edicts as well. So religion is very understandably closely connected with ethics in many people's minds and in many people's lives. So the first claim is similar to what we saw under the relationship between ethics and law, that is, the claim that they are indistinguishable or inextricably interconnected. And so in support of that claim, we notice that every religious teaching contains guidance for right conduct. It's rare, I can't imagine, perhaps you can, a religion that doesn't have some constraints or codes or requirements for right and good conduct. And also note that from the religious point of view, divine will is what makes good conduct good. The second claim is that they are distinct. Religion and ethics are distinct, yet coextensive and compatible. If we were to draw Venn diagrams, the two circles of the Venn diagram would overlap each other completely. And that they're compatible, such that we wouldn't find an ethical requirement that would be contrary to a religious requirement, nor would we find a religious requirement that would be contrary to an ethical requirement. That's what that claim is asserting. And in support of that, we have the sense that religion provides a basis for believing some conduct to be good or bad. What makes a particular action right or wrong is whether it's approved and sanctioned by the divine within that religious framework. And on this claim also, we would say, well, look, ethics provides a different basis for the same assessment, but really what we're talking about is the same thing. A third claim about the relationship between ethics and religion is that they are logically and culturally independent. Okay? Where religion is the domain of prayer and piety and deference and service to God or the divine and what God values. Whereas ethics is the domain of justice, well-being, virtue, and the effort, the attempt to solve what are very real human problems. For those claims 1 and 2, we note there are some problems. That is, that there are disagreements across different religions. We have many competing religious faiths with many competing traditions and many competing requirements for right conduct. And so how do we reconcile which conduct is the conduct we ought to follow other than by the degree of faith we have in the particular religion in which we have faith. We also notice that even within the same religion, there are individuals who disagree. A recent example of that is within the Catholic faith, within the Catholic community. There is significant disagreement about the permissibility or impermissibility of the use of contraception. And while many of the Catholic community, especially in the administrative levels, archbishops, bishops, priests, cardinals, and so forth, believe that contraception is impermissible, that we ought not to engage in contraception, many of the lay people and many of the ordinary members of the community, people of Catholic faith, believe that it is permissible and do use it. So we see even within the same religion that there's disagreement about what sorts of conduct is permissible or impermissible that we ought to engage in or ought not to engage in. And more often than not, when there's this internal disagreement within a particular community, it's usually the powerful who set the terms for what the code of conduct, what the requirements of action are going to be from within that standpoint. We'll notice this is also the case in the next section where we talk about the relationship between ethics and social conventions. And finally, there's a problem with identifying ethics in close connection with religion in that it provides no guidance for non-believers. So for people who are not of that faith or not of any faith, the prescriptions for action within that faith would provide very little motivation and very little guidance for them to act one way or another. All right, let's take a look at ethics and social convention. Ethics is similarly often mistaken for social convention or customs or what is popular. And this again is understandable since we're raised in social conventions, we live them every day, and we experience immediately the consequences for violating them. Think about how many Hollywood movies underscore this idea, where you have the outsider or the misfit who's trying to live their life, but living their life against social conventions leads them to be ostracized, humiliated, teased, abused, and so forth, and legitimately seen as the target of abuse and ostracism and so forth. So we reinforce for each other very much the power of social convention in determining how we ought to act and what we ought to do. However, we want to be careful about that assertion because it's often from an ethical standpoint, the point of view of ethics, that we can criticize and evaluate negatively when social conventions lead to that sort of abuse and ostracism. So let's look at the claim that they're identical, which is to say that some conduct, X, is good, is really simply to say that X, that conduct, is what we have agreed is acceptable. And whether that agreement was tacit or explicit, that is, whether it's explicit is to say, yes, I agree that we ought not to dive in the shallow end of the pool, for example. Or tacit agreement, which is that we just don't dive in the shallow end of the pool and we poo-poo or criticize people who do dive into the shallow end of the pool. Give them a tisk-tisk and remind them that they shouldn't do that. That's tacit agreement. Tacit agreement is agreement by coordinating one's action with the requirement in question. An explicit agreement is agreement where you explicitly state, you assert, you affirm, you sign, you document, you indicate your positive affirmation of whatever is in question. There are problems with this view that brings ethics and social convention into such close proximity with each other to say that they're the same thing or they're inexplicably intertwined. And that is that societies change over time and experience which leads to the modification of conventions of conduct. Think, for example, this country, not long ago, slavery was a social convention and it was ensconced in law, in our economics, in our educational system, and in our relationships with each other down to the most intimate and personal level. But we became aware slowly, but eventually became aware that slavery was wrong. That is, even though it was so deeply ingrained in our social conventions, it was not the right thing to do, which is to say that we're taking an ethical standpoint to evaluate our social conventions. We can't do that if our social conventions and ethics are the same thing. So ethics can provide a critical point of view on our social conventions, and that's often how our societies change over time. And with experience, we learn that what we're doing is actually wrong and not right, and so we seek to change it, remedy it, purge it from our social conventions. Also, we must be aware that no set of conventions is adopted entirely by everyone in any society, and this is a similar concern that we had with religion, where it's not necessarily the case that everyone within a particular society or community agrees tacitly or explicitly with what is decreed or determined to be how we ought to behave, what we ought to do, what we ought not to do. And so often what we find is the powerful, however that's measured in a society, are those who set the terms for everyone else. But that doesn't eliminate the disagreement. And often, as I mentioned already, disagreement with existing social conventions is based in ethical claims. All you have to do, really, is take another read through Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail, where he argues against the segregation laws and the segregation customs and the tradition of segregation in the Jim Crow South, arguing on the basis of, on the one hand, religious views, but not simply, because largely what he does is articulate an ethical standpoint, a standpoint of justice, of fairness, of equality, that cuts across religions and cuts across social conventions, and gives him a basis for criticizing the social conventions. All right, and the second claim would be that they are distinct though overlapping. Again, if we were to put two Venn diagrams here, they would intersect and overlap, but not substantially. Right? Where we can see that ethics provides a standpoint by which we can critique and reform social conventions, and that the ethical principles allow us to assess our own and other societies as ethical or not ethical. The ethical standpoint. All right, so if not law, religion, or social convention, then what? What is it? Well, in the context of the professional and the public service, this public servant, we have to be attentive to certain features, right? Because professionals and public servants have to have some guidance for their actions, which enables them to do the following. They have to be able to work effectively and efficiently within culturally complex communities. And those culturally complex communities are going to be communities that are built up of people who have different faiths, sometimes incompatible faiths, come from different social backgrounds, especially a society like ours, which is a society of immigrants still by and large. So we come from different societies, different conventions, different traditions and customs. The professional and the public service have to be able to work effectively and efficiently within that kind of complexity. They also have to earn the trust of people using their services, and they can't earn their trust if what they're doing is basing their ethical standards on some particular standpoint, some particular faith, or some particular set of social conventions which are not shared by members of the community or of their clientele. Professionals and public servants also have to be mutually supportive of the work of other professionals. So here we need something that cuts even across ethics codes or codes of conduct within professions, so that we can find guidance for how to act with other professions which may have elements of an ethics code that are not included in our own. For example, the police have to work with doctors and lawyers, engineers have to work with architects and accountants, and journalists, well, they just have to work with everybody, whether they're professionals or not. They also have to promote democratic ideals. such as equality, respect, dignity, individual responsibility, the common good. These are all things that we saw in the lecture preceding this one. And they also have to be fair in the treatment of people of different cultures, faiths, and from diverse social backgrounds. And that goes together with the working effectively and efficiently. We also have to work fairly with people from diverse contexts. What could possibly provide a basis for ethics which allows this sort of standpoint? Well, for that, you'll have to stay tuned for the next lecture and likely for the rest of the semester. Wrapping up this lecture, each of these possible sources of ethics is problematic in some way. Clearly, we experience ethics as distinct from law, as distinct from religion, and as distinct from social convention. So it can't be any one of those individually, nor can it be all of those taken together because they are often incompatible with each other. So we have to attempt to identify an independent basis for ethics, and this is challenging. That's why it's going to take the rest of the semester to do so. We have to be able to account for how ethical principles are used by professionals in all areas of the community, not just within a single profession. And we also have to identify that or recognize that a true and complete account of ethics might be elusive. However, we also should feel confident that progress can be made in the meantime. Even if we can't find a true and complete account of ethics, we can make progress, and that progress can provide significant guidance for professionals and public servants. Ethics addresses conduct and behavior where guidance is required, but where the individual's own values, where social conventions, and where the law are inadequate or inappropriate. Okay, now here are some questions to think about. And if you think through these, if you read through these questions and think through them and you can answer them, then you will have sufficiently learned the material in this lecture. Thank you very much.